All right, thanks for stopping by Dreams to Reality YouTube channel. I appreciate all the subscribers that have subscribed so far. If you haven't subscribed yet, click the subscribe button, like this video, comment, whatever the case. Let's keep this going, let's keep growing the channel, and let's get on with our next video. All right, what we're going to do now, most of you may have seen the last video about installing the outer wheelhouse. The next thing we're going to do is go ahead and put the quarter panel on. Let's get that finalized. Most of the work, hard work, for the quarter panel has already been done in the process of putting the liner on. So I don't want to say this is going to be an easy step, but we're not starting from scratch. A lot of the screw holes and guide holes that I've drilled are already there. So I can start by getting, when I put the panel on, it's going to be pretty much where it's supposed to be. The liner's where it's supposed to be. So let's get the panel and start getting it prepped. And let's get this thing on. So what exactly do I mean when I'm saying I'm going to prep the panel to install? Well, there's a number of different things that I've just done that I'm going to go over now and show you and explain why you do what you do. So I just finished prepping the panel, prepping the car. What does this mean? Well, I started by going around all the bare metal edges and putting on some copper weld through primer. Any little extra coating you can put on something, the better, the less chance you have for something coming back. There was a couple other things I did to the panel, and I'm going to show you that right now. So when I say prep the panel, one thing I like to do, doesn't mean you have to or it's right or wrong, but I've gone over the whole entire inside of this panel with 320 grit sandpaper. And the reason why I do that is on any of these restorations I do here at DTR, I always go back and I like to put some kind of coating, or have to put some kind of coating on the insides of the quarter panels. Usually back here in the trunk area, I'll put a lizard skin type coating or a splatter type coating, depending on what the job calls for. But the panel has to be prepped for all that. So get some sand scratches on it, and it's much easier doing it now, getting some of it done. Plus, once the panel's on and in those hard to reach areas, you've already done half the work. So that's one thing I do. The other thing I do is where I've put these little screw holes through, there was little metal burrs and such on the inside of the panel. I ground them smooth. Back here is the same. On this rear flange, I had to drill through, and I got all the burrs off from drilling. The rest of the panel, I punched with a hole punch. You can use a Whitney style punch, hand punch, or I have a pneumatic punch, and it makes the job go that much faster. I know where these holes have to be. Sometimes, depending on the job, I'll put the panel on and I'll have to mark those holes with the panel on, because sometimes there's voids and spaces where you might put a hole and there'll be nothing there to weld to. So sometimes you want to double check that, but I've had this on and off enough times to see about where they all go. But that basically is what prepping a panel is all about. Plus I ground my cut edges, I ground them smoother so that it's all laying, everything's going to lay against each other really nice, much better. And got one little screw hole to deburr that I missed. But that's basically what prepping a panel to install is all about. Very, pretty basic stuff. From the factory, a quarter panel is put on with a fusion style weld where it pinches the two panels together, and then the heat of the welder fuses the metal together, where in this case, in a replacement situation, or the way I'm doing it, I should say, we're going to be plug welding all these holes around the perimeter of the panel. So that's some basic panel prep. Now let's get this thing on the car. Okay, that was easy. Panel's all back in place. Screws back in it. I added a few more across the top to hold the panel against the factory panel. Now, I had mentioned in an earlier video when I explained the flanging step that I would have to probably trim some of that off where the two panels overlap each other. Now that it's all in place, I have very minimal overlap, and I'll explain again that even with that overlap, because it's minimal, on the edge that I'm welding through the new panel into the existing panel, and it's creating one seam. And when everything's all welded and finished, on the inside there'll be no overlap left. It will just be a seam. If you have a longer overlap, your weld will be at a higher point, and then below it is where, again, the moisture can get in and create that bubbling seam of death, 6 months from now. And once I have the panel welded on, I can show on the inside what it will look like. And normally what I end up doing is just lightly grinding the weld just a little bit, adding a little bit of seam sealer, usually putting some epoxy primer on first, and then putting some seam sealer on it to kind of cover it up. And most of the time the insides of the panels aren't finished. They always have some sort of texture, some kind of coating that weld seam you're never going to see. And again, it's way up on the top here as opposed to down here where you might see it. So that's how that's going to be finished. The other thing to consider when you're doing this is when you're welding two panels together, make sure they're tight against each other. Like where I have clamps here, like this clamp, for example, is a very good style clamp for clamping the two panels together, because you can clamp the panel around the plug weld and then weld in between the jaw, because you want your panels tight together. You don't want to have a space between it. Again, because you don't want to get junk in between the panels. You want everything nice and tight. So that's another part of this job, is having the right tools, and clamps are a big one. Another way, if you don't have clamps, you can also use those little self-drilling type screws, and if you have a problem area that you got to pull two panels together, put a screw next to the plug weld, pull the panels together so the plug weld is, the two panels are nice and tight where your plug weld is, and then once you get the weld in, take the screw out and zip a little weld in the screw hole. So we got everything prepped, we got it clamped together. I did run into a little issue where my panel right here doesn't want to really cooperate. So I'm going to start with this area, and when you're welding, I should say especially when you're welding a panel with no kind of bend or no kind of flange on it or no kind of body to it, just a flat steel panel, you want to go very, very slow. You don't want to create a tremendous amount of heat in one area at a time, because what the heat's doing is the heat is shrinking the metal, and that's what's causing it to buckle and carry on. And I'm using a MIG welder. I've always used a MIG welder. If you're using a TIG welder or an oxygen type weld, those welds tend to be softer. You can sometimes work those welds a little bit better. I've always had decent success with a MIG welder. It works for me. And here again, in this area right here, there's no access to the inside to manipulate the panel. So just go very slowly, and all I'm going to do is where the panel is resting against the factory panel, I'm just going to slowly work it over and get this all flush with and tight to the factory edge or the factory panel. And then from there, what I like to do is I like to go from the center. In this case, I'm going to start right here because this is my problem area, and then I'm going to work away from that and slowly tack it across this edge and get this in place. Again, moving around and moving slow keeps your heat down, and you have less chance of that warpage nonsense happening. And also, you can, I don't want to say there's no right or wrong, because there's definitely a lot of wrongs to putting on quarter panels, but I don't see it being an issue. But sometimes when I'll do a quarter, I'll start in the center of my panel, usually over my top of my wheelhouse, and I'll weld it here, and then I'll weld a little bit here, and again, moving from the center towards the outside. If you keep your heat, in my experience, if you keep your heat to a minimum and you move slowly to keep the heat low, you have less tendency for things to go crazy. But if you do one area or the wrong areas first, or you do too much in the wrong areas first, that's when the panels will go crazy on you, and sometimes it's hard to come back from. So taking your time is most important thing. No need to rush, especially when rushing can amount to consequence. You want to take your time and get it right the first time. So those are some little pointers and basics of this part. I'm going to fire up my welder and I'm going to get this thing tacked on, get her started. So what ended up happening is the panel had a little bit of a crown to it. So by working it in and bringing it in, I was able to get the seam against and welded. The problem is I did end up with a slight little low spot right here. It's going to need some extra attention. What I can more than likely do is, once I get the entire seam welded, I can come back with my stud welder gun, put a couple studs on it, try and work this out a little bit more, just to, you know, minimize some filler. Needs a little filler. That's kind of how it is. The cars you see that are perfectly laser straight and, you know, just look beyond unreal. Newsflash, they all have filler in them. You don't want to build a car out of filler, but to get a car absolutely perfectly straight and smooth and so on, you always end up with either body filler or layers and layers of primer. So just the fact that I have to put some in here is just par for the course. It's just how these jobs are. Again, I'm not building the car out of body filler, but I'm using the body filler just to make things just so and just perfect. So again, I don't see this as a big deal. I can do a little bit with this to remedy the problem, but in the meantime, I'm going to continue welding the rest of the entire panel on. And I'll worry about this later. All right. So let's review what you just saw. I got my tacks all the way across. All right, then I went down and I got a couple welds around the liner. I went and got a couple across here, up back here, just getting the entire quarter in place. A couple down the front seam. Now again, this seam going up here will be solid welded. This seam going across here will be solid welded. The rest will be plug welded. And we also got welds down in here. Hope you can see all that. Those welds are all down into the rocker. So we got the whole quarter basically, you know, in place. This is where it's going to be. Now, I will say that at a couple spots going across the top, if you can see right about here where that little bubble happened, we'll have to mess with that. And there's a couple other little areas where I can feel some waves. And again, this isn't a perfect world. This is a product of skins. You're gonna have this, you're gonna always end up with doing a little bit of filler work across the seams. Maybe there's some magicians out there that can do it without any body filler, and you know, God bless them and good for them. But you know, in my experience, this is kind of par for the course. You're going to have this. That's why I'm a bigger fan of full quarters, but we don't always have that option. And in this case, we didn't. Again, let's go back to our door. Still got a nice door gap. Body lines line up. Pretty nice. So now I can go ahead and continue welding. What I'll probably do is weld more tacks in between the tacks I've already done, again, so that rather than, this is about 2 inches, rather than blasting a 2-inch weld across here and making all that heat in one spot, I'll narrow that down and do, you know, 1 inch at a time. And again, as you saw, I jump back and forth and back and forth, keeping the heat moving. I was using the blowgun and feeling it with my hand to see that the heat wasn't rising too much. So that's the next step in getting this thing finished up. Again, most of the prep work came with the wheel well, part of the job. And the work I did previous to that, which was the initial fitment of the quarter. But again, the quarter kind of goes where it has to go based on the the body lines and so on. So I'm going to continue welding in between the welds. Once I do all that, I'll go around my plug welds, and I'll probably just do all the plug welds, because again, where the plug welds are, I have a flange I'm working with, and you have a lot of body lines, a lot of strength, and you can't really distort a panel doing that sort of welding. It's this flat flangeless type panel is where the warpage will happen more than anything else. So it's coming along. All right, now we are all welded. Big worm weld all the way down. Oop, got one little spot I missed there. Have to follow up with that. All our welds, some of them prettier than others. Welding upside down isn't always fun. All welded in our wheelhouse. Screw holes welded shut. Core jam weld all the way solid. Finished our welds inside. Trying to see. Yep, there we go. Those are all done in there. And now that it's all welded, we have a very slight ripple, not back here where the trunk is so much, but up in this area, got a little bit more ripple to it than what I had hoped it would. But here again, it's a product of this just being a flat single panel laying over another panel without any kind of real strength to it, and it will happen. And again, a little bit of filler work will straighten all that up. It won't be any kind of excess. It'll get that right back in shape. So next thing to do, obviously, is to smooth out the welds. And once we smooth out the welds, actually let's take a look at our door gap again. It's a very nice maintained door gap. Looking good. We didn't lose our trunk gap at all. I didn't think we would, but it's good to check these things. So I'll get the weld smoothed out, and then I'll be putting just a little, probably a paintbrush coat of epoxy primer over the welds, just to keep the moisture and crap off of them until I'm able to go further with this project. At this point, these are the only panels I'm able to put on. The other panels are on back order. So we'll get this side finished up. Okay, here we are. And I got all the welds ground smooth around the whole panel. went ahead and just put a little bit of black epoxy primer around over all the welds to protect everything. So all in all, I think it turned out pretty good. We did get a slight bit of wave in the panel right at the top here. Again, this is far from done. This whole car is getting restored, so I'll spend a little bit of time straightening the metal a little bit more, and then, like I said earlier, it'll get a little bit of filler work, and it'll look just fine when it's all said and done. So that is my version, DTR's version of a quarter panel skin installation. Again, this is how I've done things over the years. I'm not telling anybody how to do anything or saying this is the only way, but this is the way we do it, and I hope that after watching this you may have learned a little bit, learned something, got something out of this. That's the point of this channel. So again, if you have any comments, feel free. Criticisms, whatever. Criticisms don't hurt either, because we're always learning from each other. So, like the video. If you like the video, subscribe to the channel. It's much appreciated. And thanks again for watching DTR's YouTube channel.